Hey everybody, this is Andre here with the Kevin Breeze channel, and this is pros and cons for the BLU G71. Let's get started. My first pro for this phone is the size of the display. This phone has a 6.5-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So it's definitely on the larger side, which is going to be really good for stuff like content consumption, especially when it comes to reading, if you have to see those little details, or if you're streaming videos, even gaming. With pretty much any task you're going to be doing with your phone, having a larger display is beneficial, but at the same time, this phone is not so large that it's uncomfortable to carry around. My next pro for this phone is the storage. This phone has 64 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion, which is really impressive for a phone like this. In this price range, most phones are going to have around 32 gigabytes, and some of them have as little as 16 gigabytes. Nowadays, with apps getting larger and larger and the system taking up its fair share of storage on phones, it's important to have as much storage as you can get. And with 64 gigabytes, this phone is well above the average in its price range. There are only a few phones like the Samsung Galaxy A02, for example, that really have this much storage at this price range. Even some phones like the Motorola Moto G Power, for example, have variants with only 32 gigabytes, and that phone is a little bit of a step up from this one. So that just goes to show how much of an advantage it is to have 64 gigabytes of internal storage with this phone. The next pro for this phone is the battery. With a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, you're not going to get much bigger as far as that goes, and having a large battery has a couple different benefits. Of course, you're going to get more life per charge, but it's also going to last longer down the road throughout the life of the phone. If you have a smaller battery, it's going to wear out a lot faster, whereas with this one, it's going to last for quite a bit longer than a phone like the iPhone 12, for example, that only has a 2,815 milliamp hour battery. With almost double the battery size of the iPhone 12, this phone is definitely going to outlast it. And if you prefer to keep your same phone for as long as you can and not have to buy them frequently, this is a huge advantage. My next pro for this phone is the overall design. Despite being a real inexpensive entry-level phone, this phone looks really good. We have super thin bezels here and a hole punch front-facing camera, while most phones in this price range have a water drop notch, which I think is pretty ugly. I think it's super outdated and makes cheap phones look even cheaper. But with this hole punch design, it looks a lot better. The phone has a really thin design, so it feels more sleek and modern. And the back is made of this red material that I think makes it look a lot more unique and interesting. Overall, aesthetically, I think this phone was designed well and looks really good. My final pro for this phone is the software. Now, even though this phone doesn't have Android 11, it does run on Android 10. The skin for this version of Android 10 looks really nice, and it's super simple too. There's not a whole lot of bloatware or anything on it. Besides the apps that I've downloaded onto this phone, there's really not a whole lot on here taking up space. We don't have a bunch of those unnecessary store apps or anything like that. It's really just the bare essentials, and it's super intuitive and easy to use. So if you're new to Android or smartphones in general, you're gonna have a much easier time using this phone than a phone that has a little bit more complicated of a skin, and you won't have to deal with all those unnecessary apps that come in some devices. Now, my first con for this phone is the processor. This phone is getting 3 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A25 processor. We ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 147 and a multi-core score of 873, so it's really not that impressive. Now, compared to a lot of phones like the Samsung Galaxy A02, for example, this is actually pretty good. The Samsung Galaxy A02 is a lot worse than this, but in comparison to a lot of others, it's still really not that good. For example, the OnePlus Nord N100 has a multi-core score in the 1100s, and this is a pretty similar price range. Overall, you can do a lot better, and if you're trying to do anything more than just basic activities like web browsing and social media and then basic mobile functions, you're probably going to be disappointed, because this phone's not going to be able to run things like games and that sort of stuff very well. My next con for this phone is the Google Assistant button. I'm going to give you an overview of this phone's hardware real quick. There's nothing going on up at the top. On the right side, we have our power button and our volume keys. On the bottom, we have a speaker, a USB-C charging port, the microphone, and a headphone jack. Finally, on the left, we have the slot for the microSD card, and of course, the dreaded Google Assistant button. This button is such a nuisance. It's so easy to accidentally trigger, and not everybody uses Google Assistant. You could be trying to take a screenshot and accidentally trigger Google Assistant, and there we go. It just turns on out of nowhere, and if you say the wrong thing during that time, you could accidentally do something on your phone that you didn't mean to do, and it just creates another hassle. It's one of the most annoying features I've seen in a phone. I've never seen a use for it, and there's just really no point. There's so many different ways to activate it. Having a voice activation, for example, is something that's a lot better. Or if you wanted to use it, you could activate it by pressing and holding the power button. Some phones do that, but having a dedicated button just for this and nothing else is just such a waste of space, and it actually causes more problems than it does help, in my opinion. Sure, you can deactivate it through the settings, but at that point, why even have it at all? Now, another phone BLU makes, the BLU G71, doesn't have it, and I think that design is a lot better because you can still access Google Assistant if you want to, but with the BLU G91, you don't have to run the risk of accidentally triggering it, and there are so many situations where you could accidentally press this button and have the thing go off. It's just so much of a hassle that I wish this phone just didn't have it at all. My next con for this phone is the materials. Now, even though this phone really looks good, I don't care for how cheap these materials feel. When I'm holding it, it really does feel like a cheap phone. It's basically made of cheap plastic all the way around. There's nothing that feels even remotely premium about this phone. So even though it does look good, the materials are pretty low quality. I mean, I've seen a phone that's even less expensive than this that has better quality materials. So that is definitely a downside of this one. My next con for this phone is the camera. This is by far not the worst camera I've seen, but it really does leave something to be desired. Up front here, we got a 13 megapixel front-facing camera, and on the back we have a 13 megapixel rear camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. Now the ultra-wide camera is nice to have, I will give it that. Not bad, but honestly, the pictures this phone takes are not even really good enough for social media, in my opinion. If you wanted to take pictures for Instagram or something like that, you could probably get a few decent photos with this phone here and there if you get the right angles and lighting. But in practical application, this camera really isn't the greatest. Really not that impressive, especially considering there are so many other phones, like the Motorola Moto G Play, for example, that have cameras so much better than this. Another one I would compare to this phone is the Samsung Galaxy A12, around the same price range, similar features, but the Samsung Galaxy A12 has a much better camera. We're talking a 13 megapixel camera on this phone versus a 48 megapixel camera on the Samsung Galaxy A12, and they are both pretty entry-level phones, so that's really something to keep in mind. Even the Samsung Galaxy A02 is probably better camera-wise than this phone. So if taking photos is an important function for you, I would keep this in mind because in this price range, you can still do a lot better for the camera. My last con for this phone is that there's no NFC. Now this is a lower end phone, I do understand that. Not every phone has NFC, even though it is trickling down, but NFC, in my opinion, is pretty important because it allows you to use touchless payment services like Google Pay. And that's really something I think pretty much any smartphone nowadays should have. And unfortunately, there are still those phones out there that don't have it. And that is a disappointment because a lot of people like to use that kind of payment system for their everyday purchases. There are lots of benefits to it. So not having the technology to be capable of that is a pretty big inconvenience if that's a feature that you like to use. But those were some of the best and worst things about the BLU G71. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and hopefully you found this information useful as well. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.